As 1942 passed to 1943, the Japanese position on its southern front was beginning to deteriorate. All throughout the previous year, the war with the Western Allies had been primarily focused in the area surrounding Australia. Here, in the Bismarck archipelago, the Japanese had set up the great fortress of Rabaul, a strongly held and well-fortified air and naval base. Rabaul was the key to protecting Japan's southern flank. If it fell, then the great naval base at Truk Lagoon, Japan's Pearl Harbor, would be within B-17 range. From this very strong strategic position, the Japanese military was able to threaten the sea lines of communication between Australia and the United States, which were the Allies' main strategic weakness in the Pacific. Australia was geostrategically vital to the Allied cause against Japan, as a drive across the Central Pacific alone would have been difficult considering the lack of basing infrastructure in this area. Additionally, although in global terms Australia was a minor power, in 1942 it was, just as it is today, a major regional power, and thus it played a disproportionately large role in the Pacific War. For example, the Australian Army provided very large forces in the Pacific. Throughout 1942 and 1943, MacArthur had some 12 Australian divisions under his command, most of which would be deployed to Papua, the Solomons, and New Guinea during the conflict. In the whole Pacific War, through to 1945, the United States deployed 22 divisions to the theatre. The Japanese had used about 11 to conquer their whole Pacific Empire. Therefore, knocking Australia out of the war would not only deprive the Allies of a strategically vital staging area, but would remove about a third of the land forces opposing them in the Pacific. Thus, in its war with the Western Allies, apart from engaging the United States Navy carrier force in a decisive battle, Australia was Japan's primary strategic objective in 1942. A land invasion of Australia was dismissed by the Army as simply being beyond Japan's capability. Imperial General Headquarters determined that a force of 12 divisions would be required to wage a land campaign on mainland Australia, which was 12 more than Japan had available. At the end of 1941, the Japanese Army order of battle stood at 51 divisions. 28 were deployed in China, 13 formed the Manchurian garrison, which was required to cover the Soviets, and 10 were in the Japanese home islands. Only 11 divisions could be spared for operations against the Western Allies, a force which had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, the Bismarck Archipelago, and New Guinea, all areas which now had to be garrisoned. Finding another 12 first-rate divisions capable of engaging the Allies in what would have been, by far, the largest land campaign of the Pacific War, fought across the vast expanses of northern Australia, was a practical impossibility. Even if the other fronts could have been stripped to find this substantial force, the shipping required to sustain them so far from Japan was simply not in existence. Imperial General Headquarters decided that the best way to engage Australia was to isolate it, especially from the United States. If Australia could be cut off from its allies, then there was hope that enough pressure could be brought upon Canberra to sign a separate peace. Even if this could not be achieved, without substantial air and naval support, Australia alone would not pose a substantial threat to Japan's southern front, despite its large land forces. Although capturing Rabaul was deemed a defensive necessity, it quickly served as the base for the campaign against Australia. To achieve this isolation strategy, Japan initiated 2 operations: the construction of air bases in the Guadalcanal-Tulagi area, and an amphibious, and later land, operation designed to capture Port Moresby, the only major Allied base left north of mainland Australia. These 2 Japanese offensives, and the Allied counter-thrust designed to thwart them, would generate the 2 fronts of the Pacific War, which would rage in unison all throughout 1942, Papua and Guadalcanal. Although both operations were initially launched with such promise of achieving strategic success against the Allies, and Australia specifically, by New Year's Day 1943 it was clear to all that both fronts were ending in disaster for the Japanese. Realizing that the 17th Army was incapable of handling the Guadalcanal and Papua fronts, the Japanese southern flank was substantially reinforced. In a major restructuring of Japanese forces, on November 26, 1942, the 18th Army was activated. Under the command of Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, this new formation would focus solely on operations in Papua and New Guinea. The 17th Army, under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, would focus on the defense of Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and the rest of the Solomon Islands. These field armies were placed under the command of the 8th Area Army, equivalent to an army group, which was headquartered at Rabaul. The 8th Area Army was under the command of Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura. With the Japanese army simply outfought on Guadalcanal, a problem compounded by the inability of air and naval forces to isolate the island, and the Buna-Gona front about to collapse, on January 4, 1943, Imperial General Headquarters issued the following orders to 8th Area Army Command. In the Solomons area, the fight to recapture Guadalcanal will be discontinued, and the army will evacuate its forces immediately. Henceforth, the army will secure the Northern Solomons, including New Georgia and Santa Isabel, and the Bismarck Archipelago. In the New Guinea area, the army will immediately strengthen its bases of operations at Lae, Salamaua, Madam, and Wewak. The strategic area north of the Owen Stanley Range will be occupied, and thereafter preparations will be made for operations against Port Moresby. The forces in the Buna area will withdraw to the vicinity of Salamaua, as required by the situation, and will secure strategic positions there. Although these orders still entertain the possibility of further offensives against Port Moresby, they were, in effect, a clear admission that the campaign to isolate Australia had failed. Japanese grand strategy for the war with the Western Allies always envisaged a transition from an offensive to a defensive phase, and it was clear that the end of 1942 had brought about that transition. To facilitate the defence of Rabaul's right flank, the north coast of New Guinea, 3 additional divisions would be deployed. The 51st, which was already in Rabaul and had 1 element at Salamaua, the 20th, which had been redeployed from Korea, and the 41st from China. In addition to these 3 field divisions, the New Guinea reinforcement plan included numerous supporting elements such as airbase construction units, engineers, anti-aircraft guns, and the bulk of the 6th Air Division, a force which, in total, numbered around 100,000 men. During 1942, most of the north coast of New Guinea was only lightly held by Japanese forces, with the bulk of their operations focused on Papua and the development of the Buna-Gona base area. But with the defeat at the Battle of Buna-Gona, 8th Area Army Command began to rapidly develop these rear areas. By February 1943, the 41st Division had been successfully moved to Wewak on the far north coast of New Guinea, and the 20th to Madang, about 300 kilometers down the coast. These 2 villages were soon developed into major Japanese bases, with large-scale anchorage and airbase facilities. But the front line, the area where the next battle would be fought, was Salamaua and Lae. This most forward Japanese base, at the mouth of the mighty Markham River, was clearly where the next major Allied blow would land in New Guinea, and 8th Area Army Command was determined to deploy substantial Japanese forces in this area. However, although sea lines of communication to Wewak and Madang were secure, the same could not be said for Salamaua and Lae. The threat of Allied aircraft increased exponentially in the Solomons Sea, especially with the construction of Allied air bases in the Buna area. The 20th Division had been ordered to build a road from Madang to Lae and Salamaua, but this involved 250 kilometers of infrastructure development. Thus, until that road was built, the only way to reinforce the Salamaua and Lae garrison was by sea. However, to do so meant running the gauntlet of B-17s and Beaufighters. But Adachi knew a major battle would be fought at Lae, so the forward Japanese position had to be reinforced immediately. There were thousands of troops in the Lae area, but these were in very poor condition. The remnants of the South Seas Detachment were recuperating after the nightmare of Buna and Gona, and Okabe Detachment, a regimental combat team equivalent of the 51st Division, had just been badly mauled by the Australians at Wau. Additionally, there were several thousand men in construction and base units. The next phase in the campaign was coming, and the Japanese were running out of time to meet the inevitable Allied thrust. For the Allies, 1942 had been a year of bitter combat and hard-fought victories. Unlike 1944 and 1945, the Allies did not enjoy aggregate material superiority over the Japanese, and the Guadalcanal and Papuan campaigns were evenly matched encounters. The 1942 campaigns had been split between 2 Allied theatre commands. The struggle for Guadalcanal had been undertaken by Admiral Bull Halsey's South Pacific Area Command, which had the bulk of US naval assets in the Pacific. The Papuan campaign had been waged by General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area, which was, in 1942 and 1943, primarily an Australian theatre. In terms of land and naval forces, the United States' commitment to the Southwest Pacific Area had been small. Just 2 US divisions were under MacArthur's command, the 32nd and 41st, which were only deployed to Australia in exchange for keeping the 9th Australian Division in North Africa. Obviously, this decision by the combined Joint Chiefs of Staff does make sense, considering the 500,000 strong Australian Army already in the theatre. US naval commitment to the Southwest Pacific area was also limited. MacArthur's primary naval force was Task Force 44, formerly the Anzac Squadron, which was a cruiser force based on the heavy cruisers HMAS Australia, HMAS Canberra, which was sunk off Guadalcanal, and USS Chicago, the light cruiser HMAS Hobart, and a number of American destroyers. This force was only ever intended to defend Australia's near seas and was certainly not strong enough to operate in the Solomon or Bismarck Seas independently. There was one area where a significant portion of the United States' considerable military strength was deployed to the Southwest Pacific area: air power. On the 20th of September 1942, the United States Army Air Corps' 5th Air Force was activated. Originally composed of scattered elements which had fled the Philippines and Java, just 3 fighter groups and 5 poorly equipped bombardment groups, by the first quarter of 1943, the 5th Air Force was growing into a very formidable fighting force. In April, there were some 36 American squadrons in the Southwest Pacific area: 9 fighter, 5 dive bomber, 6 medium bomber, 8 heavy bomber, and 8 transport. The total number of aircraft available to the 5th Air Force was 1,361. Major General George C. Kenny was placed in command of this new formation. A fighter pilot from Brookville, Massachusetts, Kenny had received the Distinguished Service Cross for an engagement with German fighters in October 1918. A graduate of the Army War College, he was also an accomplished military theorist and an air warfare specialist, certainly a solid choice for theatre command. Kenny was promoted to Southwest Pacific Area Supreme Air Force Commander and was thus granted operational control over the bulk of the Royal Australian Air Force, leaving 5th Air Force operational command to Major General Whitehead. The RAAF was also undergoing a rapid expansion. In 1938, it deployed a total of 17 squadrons and a first-line strength of 198 aircraft. But just 5 years later, there were some 31 RAAF squadrons allocated to Southwest Pacific Area Command, with 8 more in Australia. Those 39 squadrons in the Southwest Pacific Area deployed 1,441 aircraft, including 523 fighters, 384 medium bombers, and 108 dive bombers. As a point of comparison, the fighter strength of the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain was, roughly, 600. The Australian government had far grander ambitions. By the end of 1943, it wanted 45 RAAF squadrons, with an eventual force structure goal of some 73. At the end of the war, the RAAF would be the 4th largest air force in the world, with thousands of frontline aircraft. The RAAF used a combination of American, British, and domestic aircraft. Its primary fighter was the P40 Warhawk, although this was supplemented by Australia's domestic fighter, the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation CA-12 Boomerang, and eventually the Spitfire Mark V. In early 1943, there were roughly equal Royal Australian Air Force and US Army Air Corps squadrons in the Southwest Pacific area. Although all were under the command of Kenny and MacArthur, the 5th Air Force and RAAF maintained their own operational commands. The Australians had a continent to defend, and constant air battle was raging over the north of the country, especially around Darwin. Thus, the Royal Australian Air Force maintained operational command over all Allied squadrons based on the mainland. The 5th Air Force, on the other hand, focused on operations in Papua and New Guinea. Nevertheless, both units were Allied formations, with American squadrons operating under RAAF operational command and vice versa. Under the command of Air Vice Marshal Bostock, Air Officer commanding RAAF, Kenny allocated 24 RAAF squadrons, 1 Royal Air Force fighter squadron, which was equipped with Spitfires, 1 Dutch squadron flying B-25s, and an American B-24 squadron. The remaining 7 RAAF squadrons formed No. 9 Operational Group, which was permanently assigned to the 5th Air Force Operational Command. Additionally, as all RAAF and 5th Air Force units operated under Kenny's Supreme Command, squadrons were routinely transferred between the two air forces. Thus, although only a portion of the almost 3,000 aircraft the Allies had in the theatre were operating in Papua and New Guinea, the amount of aerial combat power Kenny could bring to bear was truly formidable. In terms of frontline aircraft, the Japanese were becoming heavily outnumbered by 1943. Headquartered in Rabaul, the 4th Air Army and IJN 11th Air Fleet had a paper strength of 400 frontline aircraft, but operational platforms were far fewer in number. Although Tokyo was doing everything it could to reinforce its air units in New Guinea and the Solomons, they were fighting a losing battle. As with much of the Japanese military, replacing the exquisitely trained aviators which populated Japanese squadrons in 1941 was no easy task, and the supply of parts was also beginning to break down, leading to numerous unserviceable aircraft in the frontline areas. Stockpiles of spare parts are an often overlooked but critical element in Air Force operations. And even this early in the war, the Japanese were struggling to produce enough of these spares and move them to the combat area, in this case some 4,500 kilometers from the home islands. On any given day in March 1943, the 5th Air Force could muster some 700 operational aircraft, the Japanese 200. Indeed, by this time, morale in the 4th Air Army was beginning to wane. Japanese pilots complained to one another that their equipment was inferior to the Allies, and now they were not being given home leave. The Japanese were also facing an enemy that was starting to gain technological superiority. The mainstay of the Allied fighter squadrons was the P40 Warhawk, called a Kitty Hawk in Commonwealth service. The P40 was a rugged, dependable machine with good firepower and an excellent dive speed. However, it struggled at high altitude in comparison to the Zeros it faced in New Guinea. By all reports, the P40 gave a good account of itself in 1942 and 1943, but the situation began to change with the deployment of the P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was a twin-engine, long-range, high-performance fighter that really found its niche in the Pacific. By this point in the war, 5th Air Force Lightning Squadron air-to-air losses were just 25% compared to those suffered by P-40s. Its high speed, high altitude performance, and very high dive speed meant that, if employed correctly, the P-38 routinely held an energy advantage over the A6M2. A Lightning could dive on a Zero, and there was nothing the Japanese pilot could do to escape, and with the P-38's exceptional rate of climb, almost 5,000 feet a minute in testing, it could routinely gain the altitude advantage. Thus, although the Zero's renowned maneuverability made dogfighting almost suicidal for a Lightning, through the use of boom and zoom tactics, American pilots were beginning to dominate many aerial battles. Notwithstanding these worrying trends in the air war, in late February the decision was made at 8th Area Army Command to try and risk sending a large convoy to Lae. The bulk of the 51st Division was ready at Rabaul, and with Allied air strength growing by the day, the window for such a move was short. From their base at Wau, Australian forces were already probing the defences around Salamaua, and it was obvious that the Allies were planning a major offensive in this area. Thus, General Imamura decided to poke the hornet's nest. The morning of the 28th of February found the anchorage at Simpson Harbour a hive of activity. Under the command of Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, the 51st Division commander, a force of around 6,900 men were busily boarding the 8 transports which had arrived. This formation included the bulk of the 51st Division and the 23rd Anti-Aircraft Defence Unit. To defend the force of slow transports, a substantial naval and air escort had been allocated. Under the command of Rear Admiral Kimura, 8 destroyers of the 3rd Destroyer Flotilla and the whole 253rd Air Group, which had been tasked with providing air cover. In total, around 100 fighters were assigned to defend the convoy. Given the A6M2 Zero's very long range, Kimura was confident that he would have a fighter escort for the whole voyage, at least during daylight hours. The 18th Army Commander, General Adachi, who had decided to establish his forward HQ at Lae, boarded the destroyer Tokitsukaze with his staff. Allied signals intelligence had forewarned Kenny that the Japanese were likely to send a large convoy over the last 2 weeks of February and into March, and weather reports indicated that the first week in March would have low visibility over New Britain. Along with General Whitehead, the 5th Air Force commander, Kenny began planning a massed, coordinated strike which would involve around 100 aircraft. Kenny's equipment was not especially well suited to anti-shipping. The core of his bomber force were B-17s, B-25s and A-20s, although there was a squadron of Bristol Beaufighter torpedo bombers at Port Moresby. However, through the use of innovative tactics and training, these aircraft, better known for their use in Europe, were being transformed into deadly maritime strike platforms. One of the major innovations was a tactic called skip bombing. Kenny first learned of this technique on the way to Australia. It involved a low-level, beam-on attack where the aircraft would drop the bomb perhaps 100 meters from the target. Because of the high momentum of the weapon, it would skip off the top of the water like a stone. Ideally, as the bomb skipped towards the target, it would either hit the side of the ship, detonate underwater like a mine, or airburst over it. There was an old wreck which had run aground on one of Port Moresby's outer reefs, which made an ideal target for low-level bombing practice. 2 squadrons of B-25s had been selected to develop skip bombing and low-level tactics, and by February 1943, they were ready to put these innovative ideas to the test. General Kenny later recalled the scene in his memoirs. "Major Ed Lerner promised me that his squadron of B-25 commerce destroyers wouldn't miss. I saw a couple of them practicing on the old wreck on the reef outside Port Moresby. They didn't miss. It was pretty shooting and pretty skip bombing. I told Ed to warn that cocky gang of his that they were not taking on any high school team this time. They were playing Notre Dame. Ed grinned and said he would give them my message. We really had something, I was sure. I had a hunch that the Japs were going to get the surprise of their lives." In addition to the skip bombing tactic, which was effective, Lerner had developed a mast height attack where the aircraft would drop to extremely low altitude, quite literally the mast height of the ship, and use the nose of the aircraft as a bomb site. This high speed, low altitude, and very close range attack profile greatly increased the chances of scoring a hit, but it made the bombers highly vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. By the 1st of March, the Allied airmen were ready. Kenny and Whitehead planned to hit the convoy with everything they had as soon as it came into range, a mass coordinated attack with heavy and medium bombers. Whitehead had allocated a force of some 95 fighters, 49 medium and 37 heavy bombers to the attack, with some of his shorter range units allocated to attack the Japanese airfields at Lae. At midnight on the 28th of August, the Japanese force departed the safety of Rabaul and ventured into the dangerous seas beyond Simpson Harbour. Like all convoys, it was only as fast as its slowest ship, this time just 7 knots. This speed meant the Japanese force would take about 3 days to reach the port at Lae in the Huon Gulf. Its path took it along the north coast of New Britain, where it would then turn south, out of the Bismarck Sea, through the Vitiaz Strait into the Solomon Sea. The Allies knew they were coming, and several maritime patrol aircraft were prowling the waters to the north of New Britain. For the first 18 hours, the weather aided the Japanese. Hidden by cloud cover, the convoy steamed lazily towards its destination. But by midday on the 1st of March, Kenny received reports from his patrol aircraft that the weather was clearing. At 3 p.m, the crew of a B-24 Liberator peered through a widening hole in the clouds to see 16 Japanese ships glistening in the afternoon sunshine. The long-awaited convoy had been detected. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had begun. Kenny's men sprang into action. It was, to use one of his favourite metaphors, game day. The battle plan involved hitting the convoy with heavy bombers whilst it was north of New Britain, as his attack aircraft did not have the range to reach it in this area. Rather, they would wait until the Japanese formation had exited the Vitiaz Strait and hit it with a massed, coordinated attack. But the weather had robbed Kenny of the first day's battle. A squadron of B-17s immediately departed Port Moresby, but as they approached, the weather had again closed in and they were unable to find their prey. Frustrated by the weather, the Americans returned to base empty-handed, but all throughout the night, a pair of Liberators maintained contact. Battle was finally joined on the morning of the 2nd. At 6 a.m, 6 RAAF A-20 Havocs, called a Boston in RAAF service, hit the Japanese airbase at Lae with a low-level attack, bombing the runway and dispersal areas. Widely used in the Pacific, the A-20 was a light bomber, smaller than a B-25 with a lighter payload of just over 4,000 pounds. A fast and agile machine, the Boston was well liked in Australian service, and the strike at Lae badly disrupted the Japanese fighter escort. Although briefly lost in the weather, the B-24 regained contact with the convoy at 8 a.m, reporting its position as 50 miles north of Cape Gloucester on the north coast of New Britain, heading for the Vitiaz Strait and the Solomon Sea. A little over half an hour later, the B-17s arrived. The B-17 Flying Fortress is perhaps one of the most famous aircraft of the Second World War, but this great celebrity was earned during the strategic bombing campaign in Europe. Perhaps many will be surprised to learn that the B-17 was, arguably, one of the most important combat aircraft the Allies possessed in the Southwest Pacific area, specifically because of its anti-shipping capability. Early attempts to use the B-17 in the maritime strike role had been poor, as was evidenced in the Battle of Midway, which may have led to a general conception that using level bombers to strike ships was an ineffective tactic. But Just like many things in war, the problem was not necessarily the aircraft or the concept, but simply the training. Hitting moving ships from 10,000 feet is a skill, and just like any other, it needs to be built and maintained. Early in the war, results had been poor, but as the B-17 was what the 5th Air Force had, it's what they used, and soon the American pilots and bombardiers were able to show just how capable a maritime strike platform the B-17 could be. In fact, the Flying Fortress was the aircraft that concerned the Japanese most in the Southwest Pacific Theatre. Its combination of range, payload, and devastating defensive armament made the B-17 a substantial threat. One of the critical problems the Japanese faced was the fact that they lacked an aircraft that could reliably engage the B-17. The A6M20 was an amazingly capable aeroplane, a true thoroughbred, but it lacked both the armament and protective systems to effectively engage B-17 formations. The B-17E bristled with 10 50 caliber machine guns and a 30 caliber weapon, and as the Zero lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, just one solid hit from a 50 BMG armor-piercing incendiary round was often enough to set an A6M2 on fire, typically a death sentence for an aircraft without an effective fire suppression system. Additionally, although the Zero's armament, 2 20mm cannons and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns, was adequate for engaging fighters, it often struggled to shoot down the massive fortress even if it scored solid hits. B-17s would routinely return to base with evidence of numerous enemy hits that failed to produce crippling damage. These two problems conspired to make the Flying Fortress able to conduct strike missions even without a fighter escort. These trends were crystal clear on the morning of the 2nd of March. As the weather cleared to reveal a sunny day, 8 B-17s made their approach in good visual bombing conditions. Flying at mid-altitude, about 8,000 feet, they lined up for level bombing runs. This small force, unescorted as the P-38s had not been able to rendezvous, should have been easy pickings for the 33 Japanese fighters that were orbiting high above the convoy. As the Zeros dived on their lumbering prey, a hailstorm of tracer fire rose up to meet them. Like an echidna curling up into a ball to present the world with a forest of spikes, the bombers' defensive fire proved to be an impenetrable barrier, and the lumbering giants went on to make their attack runs flying straight and level. The 5,500-ton Kyokusei Maru absorbed a devastating blow when she was struck by a 1,000-pound bomb. The transport was instantly crippled, her back broken by the massive explosion. By 9:22, she had broken in half and slipped beneath the waves. Out of the 1,500 men aboard, around 850 survivors, including the 51st Division Commander, Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, were able to be transferred to a pair of destroyers, which immediately steamed for lay at 30 knots. As Kyokusei Maru was in her death throes, another 20 B-17s attacked, and although they claimed some near misses, Japanese sources indicate that no further hits were scored. The unescorted B-17 shot down 3 Zeros, and, although the Japanese were able to score hits on 10 bombers, all made it back to Port Moresby safely, an indication of just how much the Japanese struggled to deal with the huge American bombers. The B-17s returned again just before dusk for another bite at the apple. It's a little unclear exactly how many hits these 3 air raids scored on the convoy. American pilots and bombardiers claimed numerous hits, with several vessels seen to be burning. Japanese sources, on the other hand, claimed that there were no direct hits after the sinking of Kyokusei Maru. This discrepancy is typical of after-action reports as, of necessity, Allied intelligence had to rely on the visual sightings of highly adrenalized aircrew. Nonetheless, many American pilots reported several ships burning. This is probably explained by the impact of near misses. The American aircraft were dropping 1,000-pound bombs. When one of these weapons hits the water, it will detonate just below the surface. Because of the way kinetic energy propagates through water, a near miss will often cause significant damage to a ship, similar to a mine explosion. The shock of one of those weapons detonating close to a vessel can cause minor flooding and the outbreak of fire on board. Given the number of bombs dropped on the convoy, it's quite probable that a number were near misses, even if no further direct hits were scored. As night fell on the 2nd of March, the battle was still undecided. One large transport had been sunk, but the majority of the convoy was still intact. Although several vessels had been damaged, If the Japanese ships were headed for the north coast of New Guinea, there was a good chance that they would make landfall safely. Under the cover of darkness, two destroyers, Yukikaze and Azagumo, had raced to Leh and were, by morning, back with the convoy that was now approaching the Huon Peninsula. Unsure what path the convoy would take, Allied command nervously waited for contact reports from the RAAF Catalina that was now shadowing the Japanese ships, steaming under a clear sky and a bright full moon. By midnight, Kenny received the news he had been waiting for. The Japanese had turned south into the Vitiaz Strait and the Huon Gulf. Game day had finally arrived. Kenny had been preparing for this battle for months. Like a coach directing the action on the sideline, he had his quarterback, wide receivers and offensive line, and all knew their part in the complex play that was about to be unleashed on the Japanese. The men worked to be greeted by a beautiful sunny day, and the three major Allied air bases in Papua roared with the sound of departing aircraft, some 91 in total, which all formed up over Cape Ward Hunt. The convoy was now about 50 miles southeast of Finschhaven at the head of the Huon Peninsula. The Japanese knew the onslaught was coming. They had every available fighter they could muster in escort. Although the Japanese airbase at Leh had again been hit by RAAF Bostons, disrupting their operations, they managed to get 40 Zeros in the air above the convoy. The Japanese were close, only about 8 hours from the protection of Leh, but they were entering the Viper's Nest. The assault began at 10 AM. Flying in a tight box formation designed to provide maximum protection, a force of 18 B-17s and 20 B-25s approached the convoy at an altitude of 7,000 feet. Employing level bombing, the formation flew in a straight line and began dropping its bombs. Although it's unclear how many hits were achieved by the medium-altitude bombers, their attacks served another purpose. Orbiting at 15,000 feet, a swarm of Japanese fighters dove on the Allied bombers. Unseen above them were a squadron of P-38 Lightnings, some 16 strong. With the Zeros now below them making attacks on the bombers, the P-38s were in an ideal boom and zoom position, with a significant altitude and, thus, energy advantage. The American fighters dove out of a clear blue sky, making high-speed gunnery runs on the Japanese, many of which were target fixated on the bombers. After making single passes, the Lightnings would use their huge dive speed to rapidly climb back to altitude. These tactics immediately started paying dividends as several Zeros were shot down. As a B-17 piloted by Lieutenant Moore was making its attack run, his aircraft was riddled by a Japanese 20mm cannon burst, engulfing his right wing in flames. Rather than bailing out, Moore held his aircraft steady so his bombardier could line up his target. Just after the bombs were dropped, the wing came off and the B-17 tumbled out of the sky. 7 of the aircrew were able to bail out, but as the men hung helplessly on their parachutes, Japanese fighters killed them all with machine gun fire. Seeing the helpless aircrew, 3 Lightnings piloted by Captain Ferrell and his 2 wingmen, Lieutenant Easton and Lieutenant Shiflett, dove down to try and engage the Japanese. To do so, they sacrificed their altitude advantage. Now just as low and slow as the Japanese, they were easy prey for the highly maneuverable Zeros. All 3 were shot down and killed in under a minute. This is a crystalline example of how important having an energy advantage was for American fighters in the Pacific. At the same energy state as a Zero, most American fighters stood little chance. Indeed, these were the only P-38s lost in the battle. As the level bombers made their attack run and intense combat raged between the fighters, the Japanese destroyers spotted the next wave coming in from the southeast. 2-engine aircraft flying at very low altitude, the same profile as a Beaufort torpedo bomber. In a standard defensive tactic, several captains ordered their helmsmen to turn towards the incoming aircraft, as this would greatly reduce their silhouette and thus their vulnerability to torpedo attack. But the incoming aircraft weren't Beaufort torpedo bombers, they were Beaufighters. The Bristol Beaufighter was a fighter derivative of the Bristol Beaufort medium bomber. Much like the de Havilland Mosquito or Bf-110, the Beaufighter was a heavy fighter, a type of aircraft that was designed to offer increased range and firepower in comparison to single-engine monoplanes. In addition to long-range escort, heavy fighters were intended to shoot down bombers, and therefore had a heavy air-to-air armament. In the Beaufighter's case, it had a total of 11 guns, 4 Hispano 20mm autocannons under the nose, 6 303 machine guns in the wings, and a manually operated machine gun for the observer. This devastating broadside was almost unparalleled all throughout the war. Although not really comparable to a Spitfire or a Zero as a dogfighter, the Beaufighter's kinematic performance was still good. Its top speed of 320 miles an hour was only 10 miles an hour slower than the contemporary A6M2. But, much like the Mosquito, its range and firepower made it an excellent attack platform, one that was much beloved in Australian service. 13 strong, a squadron of RAAF Beaufighters screamed in just above the wave tops. As the destroyers turned to avoid the incoming torpedoes they thought the Beauforts were about to drop, they placed themselves in perfect position for strafing runs. 20mm cannon fire tore into the exposed superstructures with devastating effect. On board Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, several 20mm rounds smashed into the bridge, killing most of the officers present and wounding Kimura. The Beaufighters left havoc in their wake. Every destroyer in the formation had suffered badly from their attention. The exposed anti-aircraft positions had been rent to pieces. Easily mistaken for the lumbering Beaufort bomber, the Japanese had made themselves sitting ducks for the Beaufighters. Now, with the escorting fighters heavily engaged by the P-38s, and the anti-aircraft positions on the Japanese destroyers little more than smouldering wrecks, the fatal blow was struck. As the Beaufighters screamed off to the north, leaving as quickly as they had appeared, from the south, two waves of Allied bombers approached. Flying at just 500 feet, Ed Lerner's squadron of B-25s lined up the now helpless Japanese ships. Each pilot selected their own target and dropped to wave-top level. As the swarm of Allied bombers enveloped the convoy, many Japanese men spent their last moments looking at the strange sight of 500-pound bombs skipping across the water like a stone. The first attack was absolutely devastating. The 12 B-25s dropped 37 500-pound bombs, 17 of which slammed into the side of Japanese ships. The transports were crowded with men, almost 7,000 in total. One can only imagine the hellish carnage of 500-pound bombs detonating amongst the mass of humanity on board those Japanese ships, the rain of flesh and limb that would have surely been the result. Mercifully, death would have been swift for many. As Lana's B-25s flew north, they were immediately followed by 12 A-20s, which used the same low-altitude attack profile. The Havocs released 20 500-pound bombs, scoring 11 direct hits. As the Beaufighters, B-25s and A-20s withdrew, they left absolute carnage in their wake. After just 20 minutes of combat, all 7 remaining transports had taken at least one direct hit. One destroyer was sinking, and 3 others were fatally damaged. Lieutenant Commander Handa, who was on board the destroyer Shirayuki, recalled the attack. The vessel was attacked in waves of 3 planes, which came in at extremely low level, in strafing and bombing attacks. Most personnel on the bridge were killed or wounded. A bomb hit the after turret, a fire started, a powder magazine exploded, and the stern section broke off and the ship was flooded and sank. At 3 p.m, the final act of destruction took place. 16 B-17s, 12 B-25s, 6 RAAF A-20s and 11 P-38s made up the strike package. They found the Japanese ships right where they had left them. 4 transports and 1 destroyer were dead in the water and burning, leaving great smoke plumes that were visible for miles. There was 1 active destroyer, clearly picking up survivors from the 3 transports that had already sunk. The number of hits that were scored in this attack is very hard to estimate. Allied claims are high, 22 direct hits in total. One always has to be highly skeptical of kill or direct hit claims made by aircrew, as post-war evidence often shows them to be greatly exaggerated. Nevertheless, what we can be sure of is that the Allies left the final attack with every transport and 1 destroyer rapidly sinking, and the other heavily damaged and dead in the water. That last destroyer would be sunk by PT boats during the night of the 3rd. 16 vessels had left Simpson Harbour on the 28th of February, a convoy that had, at times, over 40 fighters in escort. By the morning of the 4th of March, all that remained were 4 damaged destroyers, limping north to try and avoid a repeat of the brutal beating the Allies had just given them. The rest of the Japanese vessels were now sitting on the bottom of the Huon Gulf. On the 4th of March, Beaufighter and B-25 crews were ordered back into the air. They had a stomach-churning mission to accomplish. In a final, macabre act of violence, the Australian and American crews began prowling the Huon Gulf, hunting for life rafts and men in the water. Their orders were to kill as many Japanese as possible, men the army would have to fight again if they were allowed to reach New Guinea. Reportedly, an RAAF pilot returned from this mission covered in his own vomit. The emotional distress of strafing a lifeboat was just too much. Again, one can only imagine the utter carnage caused by 20mm shells bursting amongst a tightly packed lifeboat, vessels that were surely packed with hundreds of men. An eruption of blood, flesh and limb would have filled the centre of the gun site as the Beaufighter made its run. With their raft blown to pieces and blood in the water, any survivors were simply left to the sharks. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was over. In a crushing victory for Allied air power, the whole convoy had been utterly destroyed. 27,500 tons of Japanese shipping had been sunk, not including the 4 destroyers. But the losses in ships were nothing compared to the loss in human life. Of the 6,900 Japanese soldiers that had boarded the transports and destroyers, 3,664 had been killed. Only 800 men, those who survived the sinking of the Kyokusei Maru, actually made it to Leh, soldiers who quite literally only had their rifles with them. The rest of the survivors, those that had been able to board the destroyers including Adachi, were taken back to Rabaul, some 2,700 in total. Of the approximately 1,000 men who were in lifeboats on the morning of the 4th of March, only 224 were rescued by Japanese submarines. In addition to the frightful losses in men, much of the 51st Division's supplies and heavy equipment was now on the ocean floor. On board the convoy were numerous anti-aircraft guns, artillery pieces, medium machine guns, and thousands of tons of ammunition, medicine, food, and other specialist supplies and equipment. But the consequences of the battle were far greater than simply the number of Japanese lives lost or the destruction of war material. The Allies had demonstrated that, in the Southwest Pacific, their dominance of the air mattered more than Japanese dominance of the sea. In the face of such devastating air power, an Allied air force that was well-armed, well-trained, and now using innovative new tactics, the Japanese Navy was forced to simply abandon the majority of the Solomon Sea to the Allies. They had massed all of the defensive assets they could muster, over 40 Zeros and 8 destroyers, but had only been able to shoot down 1 flying fortress and the 3 P-38s that dove down to save the B-17 crew. The Allies lost a further 2 aircraft to landing accidents, leading to total casualties of 13 killed and 8 wounded. Clearly, the Japanese military could not operate large surface forces in the Western Solomon Sea without the deployment of aircraft carriers or capital ships, and most of these had been consumed by the naval battles around Guadalcanal and Midway. Nevertheless, Imperial General Headquarters was convinced that Salamaua and Leh had to be held, ordering on the 25th of March that the defence of the Huon Peninsula should be the 8th Area Army's first priority, including sacrificing operations in the Solomon Islands if required. Australian forces had already begun probing the defences around Salamaua at Mubo, and Adachi was desperately trying to reinforce the Japanese positions in the area. But now he had not only lost almost a third of the 51st Division and most of its equipment, but he could not supply the base by sea. The Japanese were trying to build a road from Madang, but by April had only completed about 40 miles, and their construction activities were also being disrupted by continual air attack. Under a revised plan, fast destroyers would sail to Finschhafen, about 100 kilometers up the coast from Leh, where a number of small barges would then leapfrog down the coast, or the men would travel overland. This would, it was hoped, shield the Japanese vessels from the majority of the air threat. On the 20th of March, the 1st Battalion of the 115th Regiment, part of the 51st Division, departed Rabaul on board 4 fast destroyers and safely made it to Finschhafen. But when the Japanese tried to repeat this success, they were again met with withering airstrikes. On both the 2nd and 10th of April, the Japanese dispatched fast destroyer convoys containing units of the 66th Infantry Regiment. Both had to return to Rabaul after being intercepted by B-17s. Allied reconnaissance was so good and their long-range maritime strike capability was so effective that even fast destroyers, steaming at over 30 knots, could not make the 600-kilometer journey safely. Out of desperation, 8th Area Army Command decided to try and run a coastal relay of small barges that would travel at night. These small vessels were only capable of carrying a load of between 5 and 10 tons, but over 200 were commandeered to begin the new supply operation. These barges and landing craft would move from one Japanese base to another by night, hiding under jungle camouflage by day. By this very rudimentary method, the Japanese were able to move about 3,000 men and a substantial amount of supplies from Rabaul to Leh over a period of 4 months. A similar system was set up linking the Japanese bases on the north coast of New Guinea, such as Madang, to facilitate the movement of the 20th and 41st Divisions to the Leh area. But the Japanese were running out of time. New Guinea Force headquarters were busily planning one of the largest Australian offensives of the war. Although the Allied land forces were still recovering from the grueling Battle of Buna and Gona, some 4 Australian divisions were being prepared for the Salamo and Lae operation. By April 1943, elements of 2, the 3rd and 5th Divisions, were moving towards the Australian airbase at Wau. These forces would advance over mountainous terrain that rivaled the fearsome Kokoda Track, with the objective of attacking the Japanese defences at Mubo. But Generals Blamey and Herring had far grander plans. Codenamed Operation Postern, they intended to employ a corps-level double envelopment with simultaneous airborne and amphibious landings around Lae. If this plan worked, then the bulk of the 18th Army would be surrounded and destroyed. D-Day was coming, and with it one of the largest Allied land offensives of the Pacific War, to this time, would be unleashed on the Japanese. The Allies were about to show how their mastery of the air, sea and land made them capable of feats of rapid manoeuvre that the Japanese could simply not hope to counter.